Hello everyone, today we talk about 11th century monasticism. We haven't dedicated enough of our history of religion content to this chapter of medieval Christendom, which is not really immediately understood, right? I always remember that even as a much younger, at least when I was still studying properly, medieval history in the first years, I would, of course, score high results talking about monastic history, but I wouldn't say realize nobody had really ever explained to me what this was actually about. And of course, we're not going, I always launch this kind of provocations and I say, but okay, today we will not talk about this. In a way, we're talking about it because in every video dedicated to monasticism, this, of course, profiles itself. But as I often point out, we made so many videos about 11th century monasticism, which is surely important, but we still have to talk about Saint Benedict himself, more early medieval monasticism. Besides, this may not be the best time of the year because you have the warmer season, and actually if you look at how they built monasteries and general buildings and the time, you realize that they very well isolated both from cold and heat. However, it may be like in the northern hemisphere that the sort of the darker season isolation, right? Your colder weather, etc., is more propitiatory for a better understanding of monasticism. If you're interested in the topic, we can even think of expanding this with a series on its own. I don't think I'm gonna make it because I'm sure that none of you, or maybe just some few courageous, confirming the rule, like who actually do not care more than much about much monastic history, but also Christian history in general, right? I always get sort of less views whenever I talk Christian history, but this is not a positive thing, and in any case, even looking at themes that we have already, again, really not made so much monastic history content to the point of saying, okay, we already discussed a very solid bulk of it, right? But it's obvious that we talk a lot about the investiture controversy. We talked in part about, in fact, other monastic issues related to that, to the papacy, even just in a sort of secondary, indirect way. Today, we also take a relatively general look at some aspects of the development of monasticism during these centuries to get a better grasp of sort of the broader era, right? You need the general, not just the detail, but we will look at that too. So there is one dynamic, that is the disintegration of at least the more, what happened up to that point had been somehow, especially in the West, the more usual monastic system commenced in the 10th century. Right, the 10th century, as we've seen in different videos concerning the moral temper of the times, the second invasions, the lack of a clear center of the empire, at least in the first, and especially in the first part of the 10th century, had brought to a great autonomization of monastic centers, but also their responsibilization, their further feudalization, dynastization in a sense. And together with the necessity, however, to homogenize such way of life on the basis of the uniform necessity of a unitary intent that had been inspired by the Carolingian Empire, and that, as you know, had been part of the broader Carolingian ecclesiastical rather than just monastic reform, but it had involved, as you know, the script, but all the culture of the era, right? We have observed in other videos the so-called second Saint Benedict of Anian. So we dedicated an interesting part, at least, of our Christian history content to the Carolingian Church and also monasteries. What happened in the 10th century is that a strict monastic observance survived as still aligned with the principles established by the Carolingian reformers, as a massive legacy, by the way, of the of the same empire, and rendering, in fact, monasteries the connective fabric of post-Carolingian Europe at a broader moral and cultural level. Today we're not going to explain again what was the role of the monasteries. Of course, there was a broader, experience in as much as the hermetic lifestyle was intertwined also with the world, because the monastery was a place of ascesis connected properly with the idea that the monastery itself should be the projection on earth of the heavenly Jerusalem to an extent, and in this way, by spreading the monastic example to the world, the entire world should basically realign with the divine, and so gapping the two natures, and what we'll know at this point very well by being on Schwerpunkt altogether, like means in a broader theological and metaphysical sense. And as you know, the Carolingian Empire had been quite clever in this, because they at least had believed to be able to succeed in the concentration of imperial power through the strengthening of the ecclesiastical, properly the ecclesiastical state. You can argue, taking shape. It was in fact in many ways the most efficient part of the Carolingian Empire, surviving thanks to what had been bestowed on it. Still, truly, however, the aforementioned a bit sort of ambiguity, the blur between public and private, the ecclesiastical and the actual lay, right? True, however, this extensive liturgical framework, the mass that was sustained by this massive estates, the fact that monasteries were truly self-sufficient at this point, and of course the 10th century landscape in particular is mostly fraught with the notion again of crisis and lack of order and more. But when you look at how the Latin Germanic Europe boomed once again in following centuries, realized that it was exactly in this moment it was rebooting, and that after all, even restarting from some of these very local bases would confer an incredibly solid characteristic, let's say, to the same Latin Germanic West. Autonomy is also the key word, because in particular in the case of ecclesiastical monastic centers, these communities were to be essentially autonomous, in fact, from external interference in their own administration. We know how, again, we just said it was a great commixtion between the abbots, the noblemen. They were part of the same family, right? Endowing monasteries with rich patrimonies, creating this family, abbeys and more, had been a very, very notorious patrimonial strategy since, like, the Carolingians used it for their own family as well. I made a video looking at the massive extent of Carolingian royal donations to monasteries, for the sake, again, of hoping to balance up, like, given that these foundations were to remain, in theory, unspoiled from external interference, to concentrate power without splitting it generation after generation, which had been the plague of Frankish politics. The empire failed at that point to basically maintain its own extent, but the mechanisms that had triggered at the root, and not just as far as monasteries were concerned, would actually survive in a quite solid fashion. So you should consider this enormous Carolingian legacy in European history. The monastic reform movement, that of course was aiming at atoning for the collective saints of the empire, and hopefully maintaining this spiritual connection to provide with rulers with the adequate amount of imperium by their own virtue, right? Sustained again by this spiritual backing was the key to it all. It had reinforced in the 10th century. This was already, of course, the purpose of figures such as Benedict of Aniane, that was living, as you know, in the time of Louis the Pious, and was entrusted, in fact, by the emperor with this enormous task of literally reforming properly the Benedictine order by reviving it. If anything, considered at this point in history, every monk in the West is a Benedictine, and at heart, in core, that it's in theory always the case. Regardless, in fact, of the booming of different congregations and orders that formed later on. Benedict of Aniane would seek to standardize monastic practices across the Frankish Empire, which was also a very effective administrative need for an empire of that size. Monasteries, again, being very rich, they had to provide themselves with the adequate resources for supplying the Carolingian armies and beyond. We've seen it in different videos. And in a more spiritual sense, reinforcing the rule of Saint Benedict as the foundational spiritual guide. And again, it's a sin, unforgivable sin, not to have really discussed Saint Benedict in any of our videos yet. But this means that there will be many later, right? More in relative terms to these ones. Now, the Carolingian reforms also promoted the establishment of monastic schools that were key to establish the aforementioned standards. Here, clerics and lay elites were educated, fostering a literate ecclesiastical culture that influenced the same governance of the time. The Carolingian emphasis on monastic reform also fostered the creation in these sites of scriptoria. So, places where monks copied manuscripts, preserving classical and Christian texts that shaped medieval intellectual culture. You know that at the Carolingian court there had been properly an intelligentsia coming from all over, right, including outside from the Carolingian boundaries. Think about Alcuin of York, right, or properly the same Benedict of Aniane in his Visigothic background and beyond. Now, the Carolingian reforms also introduced a regular method, which by themselves were obviously recovering the purest imperial Catholic traditional sense of unity of European identity that was substantiated by all these scholars coming together in the establishment of, in fact, like a truly imperial level culture and sense of the broader Catholic purpose of such power. The Carolingian reforms also introduced regular synods, such as the Council of Aachen, that was, as you know, essentially the Rome of the North in Charlemagne's mentality, like a city that, yes, would symbolically remain, of course, tied to Charlemagne, very important in the empire, but also wouldn't become an equivalent, not just to Rome, but to many other important, just Eastern Frankish centers, for example. But that was, at the time, really a marvel, because it was really built in stone, which was very, of course, like this cultus, basically, that the city was inspired, of course, to the Roman architecture. We talked about the Roman basilicas in recent videos, as far as their universal meaning really had. So this was really a very precise point where to summon a synod, like the one of 1816, to enforce monastic discipline in standardized practices along the same unifying idea, significantly shaping in it the organizational system of monasteries themselves. Pope Agapetus II, in a privilege granted to Cluny, that, as you know, would be in the later 9th and 10th century, properly the heart of this monastic reform, with Aldo, and again, a word, I've made multiple videos, not much about him per se, but speaking of this reform and the moral temper of the time, here we're in the later part, the Carolingian Empire is falling, and there is very strong sense that the monastic spirituality and not only has to back it up, to at least substitute, because the empire never really ended. Of course, the imperium continued. There were different princes, pretenders, but to the extent Charlemagne had showed, like, this was no more. And Agapetus, in backing the Cluniac monastery, proclaimed that, quote, the monastic order desires the greatest immunity, highlighting the pursuit of independence from secular and ecclesiastical oversight. This is important because you would think, but what kind of advantage would there be, for example, for the papacy in this case? And I made actually a video about dedicated exactly to the subsidy, these concessions, this broader immunities conferred to the monasteries from the Pope. Pope Agapetus is exactly from the mid-10th century, so we're looking exactly at those generations, and looking at the timeline itself, you could make the case that, of course, Rome did not have yet the, let's say, the power to, especially in the contraction of imperial power that had just occurred from a couple of generations, to reform monasteries simply with that power that would acquire, in fact, in the 11th century, the Gregorian reforms and the papal monarchy. And so that it would simply go as, okay, let's simply grant privileges to recognize and to be recognized and to foster these connections that, of course, had already existed, because by this point, of course, Rome was, to say the least, spiritually hegemonic, regardless of any specifically direct control on the entire Western Christendom already. But this would turn, as we explained in the aforementioned video, into a normal practice of essentially backing the monastic autonomy, not in a vacuum, not in a simple moment of chaos. By the way, this happened in times where, for example, the Ottonians were beginning their consolidation of power, in which the same Western Frankish kingdom where Cluny was located was gradually reinforcing. In fact, there was really not such a thing like chaos or lack of actual public authority or whatever. It just was very fragmented and very privatized to a degree. Institutions were there, and of course, by granting autonomy to monastic centers, the Pope could start to control the re-expansion of secular powers, including the ones of the bishops, by the way, that could simply, for example, align with this or that monarchy as they would normally do, rather than, for example, obeying the papacy. And obviously enough, the secular clergy, the ecclesiastical administration, the episcopates were, of course, more important than the same monasteries. This was, however, the moment in history in which the monastery was taking off itself as not just as a form of, as we've seen before, hermetic spirituality, or even just merely as an atoning practice for the sins of the world in the effort, of course, through self-sacrifice to redeem the same. But of course, an enormous display of power, right, that derived from the sheer, again, cooperation of society, as we've seen, the same nobility, because this depends also on the levels, of course, of power that we're talking about, on which all these played with one another continuously. And if you're familiar with the investiture controversy, you know pretty well what this whole thing was about. Basically, the papacy, as this letter here we cited from Agapetus II, was already understanding quite consistently these new institutions had an enormous potential, and that could help foster actually a further papal control on the on Western Christendom. In fact, through avenues that had historically, in fact, not been so strongly intertwined with the rest of society. For example, the monasticism in the early Middle Ages had worked in that direction, but before, for example, the Carolingian Empire and ecclesiastical reforms, these monasteries were the product of also some sort of more politically autonomous and socially detached reality, right? At this point, everything was was to come back by the mid-10th century and universal direction that the papacy could not miss, just as we've seen also the nobility, the laymen, the same monarchies could not miss. So there was an enormous competition. The papacy having the upper hand here because, of course, monasteries were, yes, endowed with very private means. They remained somehow connected to the old clans of noblemen that had, founded and funded them. But monasteries were meant not to belong to the world, just like the church didn't. There was no hereditary. You couldn't own a monastery, technically. Like in practice, you could, through sheer influence, say if your daughter was an abbess, if the family continued to have a control in that area, absolutely. But in front of the church and in front of the same ecclesiastical institutions, they very often were even antagonistic towards monasteries. However, there was the very strong realization that if you touched these places, you committed a sacrilege, because these were communities, sacred communities, blessed by God in a way that could not really be reverted to the seculum, right? And at the end of the day, say the entire purpose of the Catholic Empire was to turn towards, again, heaven, going towards that direction. Taking pieces away from that on earth was not really the way to go. So to say that practical and ideal reasons are always deeply intertwined, historically speaking. In the words of Pope Agapetus II, you can understand the pursuit of independence, especially from a lay and episcopal oversight. Of course, you realize that here we're looking at Cluny. So Cluny was surely subsidized by many powerful noblemen. However, it was also the beginning of a more uniformed congregation that would also head towards some kind of more unified control from the mother monastery, and with therefore a coordination that was inherently making a political stance against any infringement on their own autonomy from the side of the various noblemen. Also the bishops that, as landlords, were thinking that after all, these monastic communities were tendentially also weaker for example, in a military sense, right? Could go on their own. Of course, monasteries will grow militarily powerful on their own as well. Fulda at some point is said to have been able to mobilize, we're talking the 13th century to speak, something like 20,000 fighters. Of course, these are theoretical numbers, but don't think that they couldn't field thousands at least. And Fulda is just an example, especially in a very we talked about like the post-Worms German sort of militarization of the clergy, and more for reasons that basically derive from that scarce public culture existing in the country. But in particular, and especially if you look at the 10th century, mid-10th century, bishops command probably at least the local militias. They also lead military contingents to the royal expeditions. They owe that to the sovereign by law. And of course, the lay nobility was just a more warlike to begin with, and we will talk more about such chapters. Now, as the remnants of Carolingian political organization faded in the 11th century, the principles of libertas, which is truly liberty rather than freedom, and that is an important theological meaning behind the etymology, and immunitas, so this immunity, not even exemption, but actual immunity by constitution, were complemented by this, in fact, what was properly called as exemptio, signifying liberation from episcopal control even, right? And we know that during, in fact, the Gregorian reforms, this was a moment of great contrast within the same ecclesiastical hierarchy, because many bishops would back the emperor, others at the papacy, and they were literally battling on a very different view on civilization, a more sort of historically stately concentrated of Roman legacy from in fact the papal side, in a land that was much more urbanized, much more in that sense administratively developed, literate, etc. Another one across the Alps was tendentially more feudal, illiterate. You couldn't say simply warlike, but one that looked at least at the nobility as basically the top of a society that was otherwise not particularly developed, and therefore thought they could simply control everything on their own. There are many implications in this, because as we just made a point before, this immunity revolved chiefly around the lack of any kind of protection and infringement of, properly interference of local administration. The monasteries were rich, so they had lots of lands to be administered, and the nobleman entered like kind of a mobster into the equation by saying, in exchange for protection, I will start grabbing part of your stuff. It wasn't even just about actually administrating the monastic properties, but saying, okay, we will defend you from murderers, from enemies, and in exchange we will basically acquire rights on how to manage your own place. We've seen in, for example, different videos about medieval Germany, how bishops and counts were battling even over this kind of monastic issues at some point. This is especially, again, typical of the lands where that difference between the public and the private is more blurred. Otherwise, if you look at especially countries like France or Italy, where monasticism developed, in a much more robust and sort of straightforwardly extensive way, which was, by the way, the same during the Carolingian Empire. Like the most advanced lands at that point were northern France and northern Italy. If you studied the Carolingian politics, we have like a pretty extensive understanding of why, these areas were advanced compared to others as well, just out of not just the documentation of what they illustrate. And monasteries were part of that land exploitation development, and in many ways, especially following the Benedictine motto ora et labora, so pray and work, they were pretty much involved in business, in land owning, in production, and this, as you know, will dramatically take off at this point. Now, all these shifts reflected, of course, the broader collapse of an authority that could control the entire system. You can argue that there hadn't been such a thing since Roman times, but not even, right? In Roman times, there were also different forms of communitary aggregation. The religion had been developing in a different way from centuries. But it's obvious that in medieval Europe, for how strong monarchies can get at some point, they are still largely feudal in these centuries. Therefore, many monasteries will actually be controlled in a way or another, even with a working immunity by the political influence of this or that lay authority. By the way, the papal one, right? But many others will simply have enough steam and to expand on their own and to literally create new congregations, orders, and filling even many of the gaps that Europe was had left open, like from times where this world was less populated, where resources had not been adequately exploited, and so on. It was a pressing issue to grant immunity to monasteries for the aforementioned perspective. Primarily so the monastic one, but also the ecclesiastical one to a degree that had it tendentially worse towards the lay authorities, because there were definitely some figures that otherwise would have done in their stead, right? And so in this way, monasteries managed to develop and were backed by mostly the papacy, but also some other lay lords, depending on what their political strategy really was, to assert greater control over their internal affairs, right? The spread of monastic institutions was very appreciated. For example, in Central Europe, especially by monarchs that had, at least initially, a more tendentially concentrated power, however lacking enough resources to boost like some further settled development. We're talking, for example, I don't know, countries like Bohemia or Poland. At this point, like monastic orders arrive a bit later, but they are aiming to, for example, weaken the episcopal power in these countries that was in some ways very private, very difficult to disentrench. And especially to have some kind of rural power, because usually monasteries could be very well connected, of course, to towns, cities, etc. But and they would, in any case, but they would spread in the countryside as well. So literally, you could use them to stamp the expansion of nobility or power at some point in this large, landed property. The weakening of imperial power after the end of the Carolingian Empire also encouraged monasteries to forge alliances with emerging noble families, as we've seen, that were able, for example, to foster a good relationship with a monastery in order to trigger another clan to prevent it from expanding, and securing protection, resources in turbulent times, because monasteries indeed did need protection at some point, but they would, of course, try to ensure that this wouldn't be too much at the cost of their own prerogatives. The decline of imperial oversight also led to increased reliance on local lords, who often endowed monasteries with land in exchange for spiritual intercession, because these people all believed that, after all, this highly competitive system was not some random place, right, where everybody was against everybody. There was a very strong sense, even when universal authorities were in greater difficulty, that this was a Western Christendom, that this was a true European society. At this point, you can't make the case that, regardless of how they would conceive themselves in a broader European sense or not, they had at least a pretty sound understanding that there was an imperial authority, that there was a spiritual authority. The idea of an emperor like Charlemagne, or later Otto I, and the fact that it was Rome and the papacy that the world revolved around that, was notorious in all of these countries. The rise of feudalism during this period further encouraged monasteries to secure land grants and privileges, bolstering their overall influence both politically and economically in the local regions. Historically, monasteries had always constituted such important centers, especially in the countryside for the peasantry as well. There were lots of local cults properly flowing from older times into the practices and the rites of these monasteries. There were also surely pre-Christian continuities. We've seen how powerful certain monasteries could become in different parts of Europe. This is especially the case if you think about the iconoclasm and the savage persecution that the Byzantine Empire carried out, especially on the most fringe monasteries in places like, from a Western perspective, in Epirus or in southern Italy, in Sicily, that had, during the previous centuries of fundamental decentralization, developed as veritable points of reference for the local communities. Besides, individual monasteries began documenting their customs pretty well, right? These were known as consuetudines, so the customs, which other houses could adopt, fostering a collective monastic identity. Literacy had been integrating part of every Christian community since its inception, so monasteries had always maintained some kind of documentation, records of their history. It's a beautiful chapter, actually, in codicology, in philology, in part also in paleography at this point, that, considering that the scriptoria were becoming ever more advanced, of course, reflects in beautiful manuscript, as you know, illuminations, writing styles, are such an enormous chapter medieval history. I made something about especially Carolingian script, but we'll get back to it. I sucked at... No, actually, I was good at reading in paleography, but at least I was, pretty lazy to memorize all the how you would call that weird letter with that trait going that direction in the name that some scholar had given to it that you had to memorize. Otherwise, I was told I had a good eye for it. But codicology, I would say, is more interesting even because it's sort of more akin to the archaeological side of the story, but also the philological and historical one. It tells you a lot about where that manuscript circulated, so who could have had it known, etc. Naturally, this is a very early age, but you can start seeing how, for example, imagine them as literal drawers, like would be filled with this texts that really constituted perhaps the greatest treasure of the monastery in a broader spiritual fashion. We'll surely get into this stuff because I find it very, very fascinating, and there is actually a lot of continuity even with say ancient times, like regarding things that you may not exactly imagine to some extent. But of course, in the West, literacy was actually pretty widespread, contrary to what it for considering the times. Compared to other cultures, it's actually pretty high and pretty meticulous, pretty rational, pretty well organized. Now, these privileges and customs that, of course, literally constituted the legal proof for the monastic immunities, and for this reason were very well enshrined into the most say the safest really places within the monastery, laid the foundation for congregations, initially loosely affiliated groups of monasteries led by a single abbot, which later evolved into highly organized religious orders. Right? This again had always been a bit like that. By the way, whenever we study, for example, law, normally you had disputes about land. This is the most typical object of judgment from the side of any public ecclesiastical authority during trials. Predictably enough, like very often at this point, for example, the peasantry was quite active, and there were lots of debates. We talked about, for example, the expansion of, about this in particular in the expansion of ecclesiastical power in Carolingian Italy, for example. This sometimes happened at the detriment of peasants, and there were very intense disputes. But the peasants did not have much of a literary culture, and if anything, monasteries tended to preserve their own diplomas more than basically anybody else, and equally they tended to preserve only for example, the sentences that were in favor of them. So when you study this stuff, you say, the monasteries were always right, not because they had destroyed any trace, because they realized the peasants would lose in some way, or nobody, maybe like, as it happened, I don't know, in Pavia, the capital of the Italian kingdom, would be burned by the Magyars at some point. Be forgotten, be lost, so the monastery could just get whatever they wanted. Besides, monasteries were, as you know, especially also from, Viking history, almost as a meme, of course, the target of different attacks by different actors, so to say. But they were also sometimes very difficult to actually storm, especially in places where there were, of course, within a more civilized reality, but they were in this sense also built in stone, and there were little fortresses on their own at some point, not just because they were built sometimes in relatively inaccessible places. William of Volpiano, also known as William of Dijon, was active in Burgundy, Lorraine, Italy, and Normandy, where his reforms standardized liturgical and administrative practices, creating a model for interconnected monastic networks. This guy is a pretty good example of this. He lives across like the 10th and the 9th century, right? He was, of course, a Benedictine monk, because, again, there were these other orders that had been formed, but otherwise others were fundamentally just Benedictines as a base. And even the Cluniacs was. He was a Piedmontese, fundamentally, and he was born into the midst of a lake, right, by the way, on an island that in this sense is quite tellingly sort of fitting for someone who's going to become a monk in a broader sense, because very often, again, there is this myth that monasteries were simply cut off from the world. Absolutely not. It was completely against the purpose for which they were established. Their distance was more sort of metaphysical than anything, and actually there are examples of early Western monasticism, for example, the one of the Lorraine Islands that are actual islands, as we just said, for example, in case of Vulpiano's origin, but they produced some of the most worldly and powerful bishops in the whole late antiquity, the ones of Arles, namely, that, as you know, after Trier had actually received also publicly the function of the prefecture of the Gauls. Now, William of Vulpiano is an interesting figure. We will surely make a video about him and his life. In any case, his reform efforts at Saint-Benigne in Dijon introduced a rigorous daily schedule that became a blueprint for other monasteries seeking spiritual renewal. This is how it began. How do you carry out a reform? There aren't, again, means to simply enforce a uniformation of monastic practices, but you can proceed by authority, by example, right? And so if a guy has been particularly pious and recognized as such and very successful, and, he spoke sensibly and carried out, like, pretty effective measures to reinforce the monastic administration, he was worth being followed. He would write, he would explain what he did, he would be known for his work. That's literally how also Western Europe, we said before, was feeling as part of a whole, because everybody was very interested in reading, in exchanging. Again, monasteries were particularly about this, the contemplative side of life, next also to work, as we've seen, but mostly directed at this broader reflection that would leave much space, of course, for a more attentive coordination between monasteries as well, right? Observing the world, participating politically into it as well. Vulpiano's influence at the monastery of Gordes helped establish a reform model that rivaled Cluny's, by the way, emphasizing simplicity and communal prayer. Because in theory, the Cluniac reform, again, was just the reinforcement of the Benedictine one. However, as you know, this was essentially an aristocratically led world, and so it turned out that the Cluniacs were also treating themselves pretty well, usually, or at least there were jokes about that considering the later reforms that occurred also in response to Cluny. Because their lifestyle was considered a bit too lordly in some ways, but they did really follow some strict practice and rule. Vulpiano's work at Fécamp Abbey in Normandy introduced a rigorous spiritual regime that attracted noble patrons, enhancing the prestige of reformed monasteries. Richard of Saint-Vaast governed 21 monasteries in northwestern France and present-day Belgium, promoting a disciplined communal life that influenced regional monastic communities as well. His oversights at Lobes Abbey strengthened its role as a center of spiritual economic activity, supporting local communities through charitable works as well. So monasteries, again, helped the surrounding communities, worked with them, right? They had all these important connections. You understand why they were so powerful, and also why different lords wanted to exert control over them. If you look at Saint-Vaast's leadership at Verdun, you realize how this fostered a network of monasteries that prioritized pastoral care, extending their influence into surrounding communities. As you understand, we're looking at people that travel across Europe, that visit all different monasteries. It was sort of very interesting to trace also their voyages historically, like to realize what kind of culture these people had, how much, for example, within those monastic walls, they actually had a pretty strong grasp, imagination, vision of the world around them. It's something extraordinary, even just at a literary, poetical, artistical level. Richard of Saint-Vaast's reforms at Saint-Vaast emphasized education and manuscript production, for example, contributing to the intellectual vitality of monastic centers. Of course, central figure that we already pointed out was Aldo of Cluny back in the day, but later Abbot Hugh, that presided over Cluny for 60 years. By the way, random reflection. Consider in a world at that time that probably the most obvious bunch of old people that you could think were these kind of monks, because men normally, when at war, were exposed to raids, to violence, to public issues, etc. Women giving birth was some sort of Russian roulette for them, also for the child, for that matter. And so, given that they also were out there just to make children in the system, not just that, but say, you understand what kind of life that was. So imagine just having been born more or less in an aristocratic reality, not always, but simply entering the monastery and being sheltered from most issues. Of course, like there were illnesses, that it was just like there could be any kind of disaster, whatever. But overall, these were sort of the most sheltered people, but were also revered in this sense because they, on top of this, as we explained, spent their entire life learning, and they embodied probably some of the highest levels of sort of hierarchical archetype in a world of that point. Of course, they were quite spiritually influential people exactly for this reason. And Hugh of Cluny is almost legendary. Right, we'll come back on the Cluniac order more in depth, and especially during the 10th century. He oversaw, for example, the expansion of the Cluniac order across nearly all of Europe, establishing a vast network of daughter houses that spread Cluniac ideals from Iberia to Britain. Cluny's role as a pilgrimage destination centered around its relics drew devotees from across Europe, enhancing its spiritual prestige. Cluny's diplomatic relations with secular rulers strengthened its role as a mediator in political disputes, enhancing its authority. Cluny's architectural innovations, including its grand basilica, symbolized its spiritual and temporal authority, serving as a model for monastic complexes across Europe. Initially, there was no clear distinction between a monastic order and a monastery with dependent houses, and the concept of a unified order with shared customs and privileges only crystallized in the late 11th century. As you understand there, the Reformed papacy had a key role in the process. In fact, in 1090, Pope Urban II granted Vallombrosa's privileges to all its houses, both existing and future, that maintained, quote, the same unity of religious life and custom. This is literally written in the document, establishing Vallombrosa as the, quote, head of them all. This is crucial. By the way, we talked about Vallombrosa in other videos randomly. It's not like we ever made a video about any single monastic center. We've never made that. Again, I have a regional series, so to say, about different provinces, polities, and so on. But speaking of single monasteries, I think would be really interesting. It occurred to me just now, after several years of doing this, even though, of course, like the story would be slightly different. But again, there are some monasteries in Europe that, as you know, are really incredible, and a few people know probably of their local geography and traditions. They're incredibly also connected to military issues. Think about, I don't know, there are so many. Like, again, we talk about Benedictine tradition. Think about Monte Cassino, Farfa. But if, for example, there is the twin bond between Mont Saint-Michel and Saint Michael Archangel in Monte Sant'Angelo in the Gargano Peninsula in Apulia, that were because of the Michaelic cult that, as you know, was this very empirically avenging figure, like in the tradition of the Germans of the North, that the Longobards and the Normans, especially when the latter conquered southern Italy, and so also that shrine that was an ancient Italic one of the so-called Umbrian forest, very old, again, millenary sanctuary there. You have the apotheosis of this connection. A video on that alone would be just fantastic. Now, this, say, papal endorsement we just illustrated for Vallombrosa solidified this monastery's role as a central authority for the various houses, so that had stemmed from it. And so practicing its rule, fostering cohesion among its these houses, and even just affiliated ones, because at some point there were some monasteries who said, okay, like, do we want to imitate that? Do we want to take the rule of that monastery, of that saint, of that authority that really established it? This is ever more important if you understand how crucial Vallombrosa was in sort of propagating certain ideals, certain political stances, also relatively to the investors or controversy, etc. Vallombrosa's forested setting inspired, by the way, its monks to engage in environmental stewardship, which you would think, well, what's about that? Well, it is, because the 11th century, it's still a very archaic period, and economy is still quite rudimentary in some ways. So the same monks, especially from this Benedictine background, would essentially work on their own. In this case, managing woodlands, for example, to support their communities. Vallombrosa's strict adherence to poverty and manual labor attracted reformers seeking a return to monastic austerity. You can still rent the places there, the various cells at some point, just trying to experience a bit the same isolation. Vallombrosa's emphasis on eremitical traditions distinguished it from Cluny. So you understand what kind of different inclinations these various monasteries had, what kind of history, what kind of rule, based on where really they were coming from with their own specific monastic experience. It appealed to those seeking a more contemplative monastic life. In the wilderness, again, in the desertum, and understood in the Latin sense of this place, unpopulated, and also beautiful settings, you would think, but you know how scary nature can be, especially like in the 11th century, and what kind of vision, and what kind of this forest, for example, would have in the minds of the monk, what kind of light could be seen after having experienced so much darkness, for example. Around the same time, the Cluniac order began to be regarded as a single ecclesia or corpus. The etymology is different. The first one is basically a gathering. The other is body, of course. But still, signifying this synthesis and synergic approach, with members pledging allegiance to one abbot and adhering to uniform customs, though it remains uncertain whether Cluny's privileges, or later those of Citeaux, automatically extended to all houses in the order. Right, this is a bit of a historical unknown again for the Cluniacs, the Cistercians, etc. The relative autonomy entailed also such ad hoc measures depending on the community. You could imagine like you're at the head of these congregations, later orders, and you can decide, for example, as the abbot of the mother monastery, to manage things differently because you thought, for example, that the community was more versed towards one direction or another. Of course, the monastic principle, as we just entailed, was striving towards kind of a perfection model that was better to uniform all across if the rule was in fact the right one, and etc. But still, we're living in a traditional society where these are human orders, or at least orders made for humans, that thus are different, thus have their own different background, their different inclinations, and so the different communities could and would have different stories on their own, different characters, different traits. It was completely normal in a traditional perspective. Besides, this ambiguity stemmed from the evolving nature of the same monastic governance. This uniformity had not existed before, had not been tried, had not been attempted, in part also because there hadn't been such a pressuring need or something that was just needed to be applied from a day to another as far as that was concerned. And of course, orders balanced local autonomy of the same daughter monasteries with the collective identity of the whole congregation. The introduction of regular chapter meetings among Cluniac houses facilitated communication and coordination, strengthening their organizational unity. The gradual adoption of written statutes helped formalize the relationships between mother houses and their dependencies, clarifying governance systems. The development of written charters and papal bulls during this period we're discussing today provided legal frameworks that clarified the rights and obligations of monastic orders, strengthening their institutional stability. The concept of an order was clearly articulated in Pope Paschal II's 1113 bull for Camaldoli, at a very important central Italian monastery, for especially the investiture controversy that was not over yet, especially in its hottest part. And this bull, that, as I understand, is pretty early. So the concept of order goes in parallel with that. Notes that the religious community had grown so significantly that, quote, various congregations come together by the grace of God into one congregation, and many places keep one discipline, one order, one rule, as with one heart and soul. We all know that unity is strength, Catholic metaphysics being based from this perspective solely on it. Of course, this is a return to God, because it's not some random mechanism. These congregations, even, right, not the different monasteries, but within the congregation, but congregations even, come together into one, because of course they agree, right, this is a functional system that therefore, as you hear from the Pope's words, by the grace of God, so the Holy Ghost / the Imperium, were coming to agglutinate. And this is what's really happening at basically any other level of Christian politics and society. Right? Greater powers, greater monarchies, greater cities, greater monasteries, the greater universal powers, etc. By the way, this bull marked a pivotal moment in recognizing monastic orders as properly unified entities on their own, with a shared spiritual mission, reflecting this broader trend towards simply ecclesiastical concentration of power. Right, we've seen this also in the way that the papacy dealt with the ecclesiastical, properly with the apostolic legates, and how they came to rule over specific provinces by papal direction, as far as the local churches had to basically obey, right? And so, coming to solve matters, to give a shared answers, because otherwise the system would have basically failed. And we know this succeeded, right? It favored further compaction. Camaldoli's emphasis on intellectual pursuits, including theological writing, by the way, contributed to the broader monastic reform discourse, and the fact that this congregation was ever more compact, of course, affirms the pro-papal stance that they had internationally, but also from their specific ascetical background. We talk about Peter Damian. We'll have to talk more about also Hildebrand of Savannah, that is Gregory VII, but in their previous experiences, what really made them the great ecclesiastical and theological figures that they were. Where did that stem from? Largely, especially when you talk about the Gregorian reforms, from very specific monastic hermitage and the combination of very highly advanced, for example, juridical notions. Also, as far as, for example, the lay world, very often these people were called to settle lay matters, public in the cities, etc. And this literally hermitage abstinence, like self-sacrifice, the physical torment, exposure to the elements. So something incredible if you think about that. And that really works in that regard, because it was about testing your psychophysical limits at all levels to make the world work. This is properly Catholic doctrine from millennia, even before Christ. And it's right there in the mind of these incredibly lucid people, by the way. In the 12th century, new religious congregations and professions proliferated, and the embrace of their novelty became a defining characteristics of the era's spiritual ethos. I'm starting to wonder whether I should make this about the 11th or the 12th century also for the playlist, but anyway. This surge in religious innovation was driven by a desire to return to apostolic simplicity, at least from one side, and address the challenges of a rapidly urbanizing and socially dynamic Europe, right? The things went in parallel, because from one side you had this unprecedented amount of wealth around, and people not really knowing how to address that, because there hadn't really quite ever been in cultural memory from quite a while. This came along mostly also with the challenges of politics, morally wise and beyond. So, of course, a Christ-like existence seems sort of the way to answer that. And as I just said, for the example of the Camaldoli, for example, figures like Peter Damian and others, alternating these two extremes, like entering the world, as we've seen the monks going out there and literally lecturing laymen on how to settle their matters legally, based in fact on extensive knowledge, for example, of Roman law and all the canonic one. So it's an enormous level of education and culture, something absolutely unattainable by today's people, considering how dependent they are on mechanics and so on. Necessarily needed some sort of check, like some sort of reality check, so to say, regarding the limit of man. And so the acknowledgement of original sin, mortality, and so on is an incredibly poignant dimension to even think for in the times and the places, because these people took it that seriously. Besides, again, letters, educations were really flourishing. The growth of universities in cities like Paris and Bologna, respectively the capitals of theological and juridical studies in Europe, created new intellectual spaces where monastic and secular scholars collaborated, shaping theological developments. Besides, the rise of pilgrimage routes, such as the Camino de Santiago, created new opportunities for monastic communities to serve as spiritual and logistical hubs for travelers. People moved more. Monks had always done to a degree, but the matter was intensifying for them as well. The growth of trade and urban centers created new opportunities for religious communities to engage with lay society, fostering the rise of mendicant orders later on. And in fact, the latter would be, in fact, some of the most international orders, also as far as education were concerned. Literally sent them out of the monastery to learn, say, of course, in the various houses of the order, in places like the St. Paris and so on. And today we freak out because of AI and the possible consequences, but imagine living in the 12th century, in the 13th century, when you have, I don't know, the rampant heresies that the church must put down. You still have the Muslims at the gates. You have lots of other issues that, of course, the West is settling, but also the specific cost. And imagine just, for example, like witnessing to the development of ideas, of knowledge, and properly of minds in places like the aforementioned Paris or Bologna, and realizing that for most people out there, this was inaccessible, right? This was a very public, sort of open, en plein air, you could say, oral world as far as knowledge went in its circulation. Fortunately, we lost most of that exactly because it wasn't written. But the levels by which this knowledge pulled the lever, literally the leverage of political direction of statal development, etc., was unprecedented. Well, Catholic civilization had the answer to frame that new knowledge into a universal fashion, something that basically after, in fact, scholastics, no other culture would ever attempt, right, to carry out anymore, and especially of the size that Western civilization had become, right? And so this is incredibly potent and powerful because it tells you about the primacy of Roman Catholicism in many sort of, at many levels, to a scale that is incomparable to other civilizations in history. Now, Bernard of Clairvaux praised the, quote, new army of the Templars, as you know, in the Laude Nove Militia, but blending monastic humility with martial prowess. This is notorious. We made not maybe too many videos about the monastic military orders, but still, right? Embodying this unique synthesis of asceticism, military service that resonated with the crusading spirit of the time, and it was just in line also with the traditional historical war bands methods that today we come to think, oh my God, the word the crusade at some point, they had always existed, even though people think that a crusade is just, say, one specific, say, mode of that. But as a matter of fact, it's within the wake of a much broader flow that this culture is never forgotten. Again, made lots of videos about, for example, dubbing in Carolingian and Ottonian times, what probably the soul of chivalry is, what medieval knighthood was about. Lots of you have the playlist, but there is a lot new content about that incoming. The Templars' strategic alliances with European monarchs bolstered their political influence. They had houses pretty much everywhere across the West, enabling them to expand their operations across continents, literally from a logistical and strategical point of view, because monasteries provided also some of the finest, I don't know, the war horses. What would you think that actually breed, for example, such animals? Like monks were behind this, and this is also notorious. The Cistercians were particularly into this kind of also land exploitation. At this point, 12th century, economy is booming in unprecedented way in the West. The Templars' financial networks, including some proto-forms of banking we shouldn't exceed, but still, again, considering the wealth they managed, supported, of course, both their military campaigns and pilgrimage efforts. The Templars' establishment of fortified preceptories across Europe facilitated the protection of pilgrims as well, and the expansion of Christian influence in the Holy Land when established in Outremer. In 1131-32, Bernard of Clairvaux listed the Camaldolais, the Valombrosans, the Carthusians, the Cluniacs, the monks of Marmoutier, Caen, Tyrone, and Savigny, alongside his own Cistercians, as supporters of Pope Innocent II against his rival Anacletus II. This is properly in Bernard's the Laude 4 and in the Epistola 126. So that you realize from a guy that can't foster properly and we made videos about Bernard of Clairvaux's ideology as far as we talk about the Templars as well, but that fostered that sense of Catholic unity and regeneration in that military effort, right? Well, how important it was to depict also these other more peaceful orders to naturally unitary action in support, in fact, of universal authority, the papacy against an anti-pope, right? And we have, by the way, made a video exactly about there was a triangle between the empire, the papacy, and the Normans regarding as that anti-pope was concerned. So again, I'm proud to say that we're really delving fairly in depth into at least some aspects of medieval warfare that is of medieval history that would otherwise pass a bit as unnoticed. In fact, the diverse coalition of monastic groups highlighted their collective support for papal reform during the investiture controversy. We've seen how collective the monastic interest was in order to receive papal backing and vice versa. Again, made multiple videos. There is a playlist, by the way, about medieval monasticism. If you're interested, you can find the more recent uploads there, if you don't know to search otherwise. The alignment of these orders with Innocent II in that case reinforced, of course, the papal authority, countering the influence of secular rulers in ecclesiastical affairs, because anti-popes were never sort of springing out like mushrooms for no reasons. Now, the schism galvanized monastic leaders to articulate their theological and political alignment with the papacy, strengthening ecclesiastical unity. And again, it's not like all monasteries or all bishops would simply side with the papacy at all. That's why, for example, of course, this would produce, like the investiture controversy alone, an incredible amount of knowledge and intelligence. Just think about the recovery of Roman law, the affirmation about the Decretum Gratiani that we made multiple videos on, also as far as the military theory was concerned from the papal side during the Age of Crusades. The schism prompted, on that occasion, monastic leaders to articulate their allegiance to the papacy, reinforcing the church's authority in a divided Christendom. That's how useful the orders, the congregations, had been in their unitary direction. The Premonastrensian bishop Anselm of Havelberg, that we have encountered already here and there, emphasized the novelty of various forms of religious life in the first book of his dialogues, using the imagery of the 7 seals of the Apocalypse to illustrate the unfolding of God's plan for the church, meaning that the question mark posed by the innovation, like the fact that nobody really knew, of course, how this would have eventually evolved. Again, for the same traditional monastic ways, this had been an important step further, but you're not to worry about that much. Like, God knows. It's just like the 7 seals. They're indiscernible. You can't simply decipher them in a human sense, but you know that they have a specific purpose that God has set there for you. Also, St. Anselm diplomatic missions to Constantinople highlighted the potential for monastic orders to bridge Latin and Byzantine Christianity, right? And we made a video about Anselm, whose writings also engaged with contemporary debates about the role of the church in a changing world, advocating for dynamic monasticism. Anselm's theological reflections underscore the adaptability of monasticism to contemporary spiritual needs, bridging traditional and innovative practices. These are the times, again, literally of the Anglo-Normans, literally a world was changing as far as, the Norman conquest of England. And with a church that was simply there, right? That's when you study war, when you study international relations, you look at these powers and say, oh my God, they were like one against the other. The fact that the church existed, as we've seen, as this connective fabric across the world. Of course, there was much that the same lay cultures shared, and that we shouldn't underestimate. But they were also fostered, backed by this more sort of contemplative sense of need for unity that monks had been developing. Among the followers of St. Augustine, Anselm discussed the order of St. Rufus and his own order of Prémontrés, whose founder Norbert led many houses to, quote, the perfection of the apostolic life. Norbert's focus on preaching and communal living distinguished Premonstratensians. This is from the monastery of Prémontrés, as a dynamic force in the 12th century reform. Those were quite powerful in northeastern France, especially. Their establishment of hospices along trade routes provided shelter and spiritual guidance to merchants. For example, the Champagne fairs were closed. It's not a coincidence. So to travelers as well. But, this corner, we've seen in many videos between France, Flanders, England, etc., was ever more internationally relevant. The Premonstratensians' emphasis on missionary work and extended their influence into rural areas, spreading Christian teachings beyond urban centers, because again, these monasteries both land and people came to live on there. They were settled. They also, by the way, were spreading in other faraway countries, not contiguous just to these ones. As we were talking about Central Europe before. The Premonstratensians' establishment of double monasteries, for example, housing both men and women, reflected a commitment to inclusive spiritual communities. There were different levels to that. You understand how relatively innovative this was, and also some people would disagree with these practices. Among the followers of Saint Benedict, Romuald, and I made a video about him too, so I'm glad at least we have enough references. Of course, I think I made just one video about him, and Saint Romuald is so key, but you already have something to fall back on in case you wonder what we're talking about. Established what was described by the sources as a new habit with a new fervor at the aforementioned Camaldoli. Vallombrosains differed from other monks by this new order, new habit, and Citeaux was another new congregation of monks differing in order and in habit from all who were, according to the sources, here it's literally the words of Anselm of Havelberg in his aforementioned dialogues 1:7, if you're interested, are called and are monks marked by patience, humility, observance of the rule, love of poverty, and religion. The Cistercians, in particular, sought a stricter adherence to the Benedictine rule as far as the working side of the story was concerned, in fact, rejecting the Cluniac elaboration in favor of simplicity and manual labor. Again, the Cluniacs had passed a bit too spoiled, observing, for example, when to eat fish, but apparently hiring the best cooks for having the fattest of that examples. Well, those were jokes in part, but remember what is happening in Europe here at the time of Cluny's establishment. We're looking at post-Carolingian Europe. We're talking largely across the Alps, also still like a largely vassalic feudal society. Those monks were also largely coming from those aristocratic families. At this point, Europe is booming, also from the lower estate, and also on a larger scale. So there is some more collective but also impersonal dimension that, in a sense, favor that uniformity, that stricter adherence to a discipline that transcends the individual. But it also contains sort of different kind of mentality. Here, in the case of the Cistercians, a truly entrepreneurial one, as we said before, these guys even specialized as far as war horses breeding for, the military. So they were shipment directly to the Holy Land, because over there they didn't have the means just to get those animals, by the way. And I also made a video in which I explained how actually those mounts turned out to be superior even to the ones that were being used from the other side, like during the Crusades. This was true for Spain too. This predated the Cistercians, but it's something that we tend to overlook in a sense. So when you look, for example, at the Cistercian environmental practices, such as wetland reclamation, you realize that the order demonstrated its commitment to sustainable land management. It was very important in this time. You didn't have to overly exhaust the land. A great advantage at this point in history, as we were recalling before, was that large parts of Europe were yet to be deforested, so cleared, reclaimed, for allowing properly a support of people that continued to rise to mount up, but lacking enough surplus to sustain themselves, and having, in fact, in the sense to be relocated and going over to colonize other lands, maybe in Central Europe, under the guidance of the nobility that acted in parallel with the monasteries, as you say, because it was an opportunity to have such houses in your own territory, especially if they worked the land so well. And largely, it was also their peasants who worked their land so well. It wasn't just the monks, right? It was the people who came to settle on the lands that the monks had reclaimed and deforested through. So again, other workers, but for the purpose of augmenting the amount of people that lived on their land, which was the actual wealth, like labor force, supporting their economical stability. The Cistercian use of lay brothers in this sense, or conversi, was very effective because it allowed them to expand agricultural production while maintaining a focus on spiritual discipline. And so you had a part probably of the Cistercian order that was also more sheltered. They worked, but there were people that could be more out there and in the world properly working alongside them, and in this sense managing the aforementioned labor force on their behalf, right? So it was a very advanced and sophisticated administrative system, and especially these orders had an enormous amount of land all around. And by the way, there would be a great crisis of monasticism in the later Middle Ages. That's also a very important topic we never covered. But these orders largely remained up to, in some cases, up to the French Revolution. I mean, it depends really what we're looking at. The aforementioned Camaldo, the Vallombrosi still exist. More or less all across Europe, older orders are there, but of course quite reduced in scope and size compared to, obviously, to contemporary times and mentality, but not being in this sense less important or inspiring. The Cistercian agricultural innovations, such as the use of the famous grange, so the aforementioned transformed monastic estates into economic powerhouses that they knew well how to organize, supported their spiritual mission. James of Vitry, that we mentioned in other videos for other types, say, of content of his, in the chapter on the renovation of the Western Church, in his History of the Western Church, written around 1220, described the orders of Citeaux, Calatrava, Val-de-Choux, Chartreuse, Grandmont, and Tyrone, the Black Monks of Cluny, Canterbury, and Affligem, the Black Nuns of Fontevraud, the Augustinian Canons and Orders of Prémontré, Arouez, Saint-Victor, and the Holy Trinity, the Trinitarians. The canons of Bologna, that were Dominicans, the Umiliati, the hospitals for... I made a video about the Umiliati, by the way, if you're interested in those. The hospitals for the poor and lepers, secular canons, and Friar Minor, the Franciscans. So James of Vitry is it's a very important source at this point of the later 13th century. So we're later compared to our he lived across like the 12th and 13th century, but in a time that could witness, in fact, the establishment of the mendicant orders. And so again, it's yet another era, right? Today we went a bit across like a bit more than 1 century, but this is exactly the peak of such monastic expansion, also the one of gradual papal control over the same, for which this is not just like a disorderly rabble of people that want to do whatever they want autonomously. No, this is rigidly framed within a Catholic hierarchy that oversees the whole spiritual work across Europe, but also together with the secular clergy deriving from the same papacy, with the metropolites, the bishops, the priests, etc. So living in the world, right? Living unavoidably side to side to the secular, to the lay authorities, to the emperors, to the kings, and even abroad, because these, as you know, from the mendicant orders, etc. Like just think about Saint Francis, like across, like trying to evangelize even the Muslim lands, even during the Crusades. The Sultan of Egypt was very interested by Francis, and he was welcoming for that matter, because it was understood across religions, even that these individuals were gifted. Well, Saint Francis of Assisi, we made a video about him, and we shall make many more. Were provided really with enormous spiritual power, enormous moral worth. So when looking at all these orders and groups in general, you realize that they constituted individually a broader spectrum of religious expression, from contemplative monasticism to active engagement with the laity. The Franciscans' embrace of absolute poverty inspired lay followers to adopt simpler lifestyles in a times of which, in fact, for many, like urban life and wealth especially had become overbearing, just for he had been out for the Saint Francis, influencing in that context, especially urban spiritual movements. The Dominicans and the Franciscans would become incredibly useful tools to finally enter the cities, and for the Pope, on behalf of the Pope, to check also episcopal power within what was the heart of his own jurisdiction, for that matter. So in moral terms, I don't know, even writing testaments in favor of the Dominican or Franciscan houses as opposed to the local church was actually local parish and episcopate was actually a big deal, also money-wise. And there are, of course, many reasons for all this. I made, if anything, here I don't remember how many videos about the mendicant orders, but we began to look at some of that in fair complexity, at least for YouTube standards here. Because I'm in a different place in these last days. The computer is slightly slower, nothing to be concerned of. Mendicant, rather. "11 videos about that. So it's not bad. It's not bad. We could do more, definitely. We will do more, but it's a good basis where to start from. So the Dominicans, as you know, had been focusing largely on theological education, mostly laying the groundwork for their role in combating heresy and shaping medieval scholasticism in the process. Basically, the Franciscans will be normalized from the literally heretical elements that exist in their fringe, and to caused actually trouble to Saint Francis. And eventually they were basically, they turned into a organizational and disciplinary speaking a copy of the Dominicans, as far as education was concerned. In fact, some of the greatest scholars at the time came from both mendicant orders. The rise of hospitals and charitable institutions under religious orders addressed the growing needs of urban poor, integrating social welfare into their mission. This was sort of an extra layer to what historically the church, the bishops had done, right, for the city. And because, again, cities were overly expanding, as is, let's say, literally expanding in the greater cases 3 or 4 times outside through different city rings, in fact, to the original Roman one. So literally you needed other people taking care of this, for example, of the pilgrims, but of the poor in general. That were just such before they were basically taken out, or at least internated in specific buildings during the modern era, were sort of just a broader archetype, let's say anthropological archetype of the medieval world. Also these wanderers, these vagabonds. There was something sustainably traditional about that, which prompted some moral and social exempla that were useful for those times' religiosity and even politics. Besides, everybody now could participate to a different type of community that allowed them, giving their personal spiritual concerns about afterlife, about existence, about sin, about works, etc., like living a bit in the world and a bit outside, right? There's various orders we already mentioned before of secular people, including the same priests. At some point, a few people at least speak about this, that priests themselves could belong to some other kind of orders. Married people, obviously, as well. Often widows, that really constitute an important number measure in there, also because, as you know, a manless woman was not very protected in a world like that. And, of course, normally, in fact, the state, the authorities, lay and ecclesiastical alike had taken care of them. Virgins, say, orphans, typically, but also soldiers. There were really lots of great knights, people who had spilled blood their entire life. At some point, they decided to end their days in these orders, but also in monasteries in general. Merchants, peasants, artisans, that would have noticed how they were not... they were essentially renouncing part of the world and transferring part of their moral capital, so to say, into religious life, so that they could be regulars of among the Christ's faithful, serving the Lord under the rule of the gospel and living in an orderly way under the one highest and supreme abbot. This is what James of Vitry was literally describing in his Historia Occidentalis, chapter 34, illustrating again the plenitude and the functionality, the rationale of these communities. Today, people perhaps wouldn't understand. I think it's actually a pretty relatable concept, telling the truth. It's rather people wouldn't be so morally inclined to be literally up to that, right? And this was an open vision, after all, because literally the church had allowed, properly for the integration of different visions, expanding the concept of religious life to different layers in the full normality of traditional sort of echelons, degrees, to encompass lay devotion. After all, when you look at the integration of the evangelical papiristic movements, the outcome was the mendicant orders. Basically was a filter, like was a heretic that does not want to accept, say, mostly theology, Catholic doctrine, even before papal authority, that they were trying to mimic, including with the Inquisition, except they were wrong, and that in fact were taken out also by just God's test of the imperium, and that to which also the lay authorities, as you know, quite contributed, especially such a successful one like the Kingdom of France and its quite militarized and imperially minded nobility. But leaving inside, it said those who had perhaps doubts, and this had stemmed from literally, as very early in time. These were sometimes movements that you hear of maybe in late antiquity and had somehow died out because civilization had not been so thriving in between. And then they reappear now at the peak of medieval civilization, including the heresies, the usual money hands, etc., with the bogomils, the catters, and so on. And those were fortunately taken out. They even triggered so much the Byzantines to even call a crusade, which was totally alien to their culture for that. So, but the others were sort of normalized and better educated and framed. And by the way, these orders gave a great opportunity for literacy spreading among the faithful, protection, as we've seen socially wise. Imagine even how communities were at the time. Like everybody, say, knew each other next door. They lived quite close to one another. There was all a corporative order, like evaluating this local nuclei of closeness, also spiritually, not just materially. Of course, we haven't talked so much about family story, but this blended into that quite strongly, so we'll come back to that. And so the heterodox had been normalized. In certain, the idea you could write a different rule, like, I don't know, the one we listed before, think about Francis of Assisi, he even had to rewrite it on papal suggestion, because in some ways it was too radical, too extreme, to correct some aspect of the saying. But that could literally say, okay, this is my rule. Well, in that case, these were all saints, as you understand, so there was a broader point for following it, other than a personal inclination. But that's also, in fact, the Catholic principle. It's stemming from your own specific background towards the one. The direction is the same for everybody, even though we are different. So you may want to have this customized path for you. Besides, again, following the footsteps of these saints was not, and being part of their order was evidently like also metaphysical matter. Right, you literally had the saint's power guiding you in a to say earthly and heavenly fashion. And we explained this a bit also in the videos about pilgrimage in medieval France, especially. But we talked also about different stuff, and I should make a video about the medieval French church in a sense, because that's quite instructive and providing great examples regarding this stuff. But it was pretty much like, any other in the Catholic essence. And so you see there how powerful, probably the connection also with the dead, with these figures, with these new heroes of sort of called the modern age, so to say. Remember that the so-called Gothic script was known at the time as actually the littera moderna. So the idea of modernity was already there in a good sense, at least. And so it's as if, by the way, you had been witnessing, especially considering the mendicant orders in the cities, veritable guilds of monks, right, of friars, with religious affiliations also among the actual guilds. For example, artisans and merchants had their own specific affiliation as far as their spiritual inclination was. Everything was in parallel. You see, these were not separated entities. They always existed in function of the rest of all of society. This is beautiful because it's organic, it's functional, it has a very specific purpose, and in fact hadn't been born by accident, right? Integrating, in this case, faith and even professional life. So again, I'm really glad to make this type of content because I think it illustrates great part of, of Western spirituality. I would say that in many ways, this is unique, as you understand, on a Western pattern, by the way. This was not happening in other Christian lands. And it reflects, again, the incredible development of Western civilization in the time, its expansion across also not just the Latin, Germanic world at this point, where it was already all Christianized together with the Celtic, but also the Slavic one that was partaking this in quite up to the majority, up to even what would become to a point the Saint Catholic Church of Ruthenia. That is an incredibly underrated aspect of the story. So, looking at, by the way, I must confess this. I'm waiting for the cycle to provide us with a topic that actually provides us with some kind of more sort of spiritual aspect of practical aspect of monastic life, in part mingling with the folklore around this sense of more like local identity that monasticism and security would give. There is that very early video that I made about Gérald de Aurillac, written by Odo of Cluny. There was a biography of a local Auvergnat nobleman. He was a knight, essentially, that, however, was also a saint. And I've always found it very interesting, not just for the story in itself, that I won't spoiler you, but it's a model of lay holiness, right? The fact that the religious figures of the time were cooperating with, and considered one traditionally with the higher order. And also, just frankly, even though I know that monastic life was very harsh and actually less romantic than we think, but come on, how cool was it to be shut down in a monastery in a beautiful location somewhere in Europe, and just living there with a beautiful taste of food of medieval times, unspoiled. Like, think about the air. Fresh air, not polluted water, something like marvelous. And this ascetic practices were actually historically carried out also by, as we've seen, warriors. Again, the monastic, the military monastic aspect as well. It's not really a novelty of this time. You just get the more documented side of the story, but it had always been used. It was not even unique, of course, to Christianity. It was a broader universal purpose. Here I was looking at the medieval monasticism playlist I created, and I noticed that a lot of it is monastic military orders, which is kind of obvious to an extent. And how many is this? Like 30 videos, and I've made otherwise, well, something, as I was saying before, about medieval monasticism in a broader sense, and we touched on interesting topics at different levels, but again, we need absolutely Saint Benedict, we need absolutely something more about single saint figures. Like, I think you agree in general, like it's important to get the systemic knowledge. And again, I'm admittedly about this, I'm being lazy because I could introduce them through some special, etc., but usually the specials are military, or most, yes, religious in nature, but we mostly address sort of the traditional roots, right? Also almost in an esoterical fashion. And again, I know that Christian history is not hyperly watched. Sometimes I have to invent. I understand now. I'm old enough as a YouTuber, let's say, to know how important titles and thumbnails. That I don't make clickbaiting. If anything, the YouTube titles are too small to tell you how cool certain things I actually find out. Just I don't want to blow my own horn, but that video I made yesterday, for example, about how early Christians actually backed Roman Hippolytus' prophecy on the Eastern Church's collapse. That was actually very cool to make. Like, it's literally what is said in it. Not much because I say that, but because I researched it and it turned out to be the case. That's mind-blowing. That's a more generic sort of Catholic history of earlier times of imperial ecumenical dimension. But always remember that this ties with what we're actually seeing now. Again, in ways, again, that is always relevant to highlight and to contemplate. I personally think that we can't go very far without this stuff. And again, I presume that there is always an incredibly important work to make as far as this spirituality was concerned. Now, of course, it's difficult to recover this. It's difficult to literally even imagine how it could have been, especially recovering their own meanings, which naturally are quite complicated to explain, mostly because of all the issues that we have today, not because they're not clear. Actually, they're absolutely straightforward. But you understand how religion is important, needless to say, especially when you look at these days and you realize that all these great sort of chunks like of the world, what kind of tradition they say, branch of tradition they stuck to, or at least there is only one tradition. Of course, that doesn't make much sense, but of course, as many religions as there are, of course, there is enough disagreement on certain interpretations. And you know that my use of the term Catholic is relatively eccentric, at least considering the conventional dealing of the same, but it is, in my opinion, the traditionally correct one. I mean, I've been studying this stuff for years now, and I think that there's enough room for actually giving great explanation. But anyway, just today, I noticed that a few weeks ago, I was recommended to a Catholic forum as even the first source on YouTube among actual Catholic makers, Catholic content makers. I mean, I don't remember very specifically about history, etc., but that's a honor for me, because this is, it's a Catholic channel in the way I mean, of course, Catholic. But of course, I've always, again, as I always say, I have this. I'm primarily I'm a medievalist and primarily a military historian in general, that transcends, in fact, the medieval background. But next to the medieval background, I also have literally some history of religion background, and so I ended up, like, throughout my career, also in relatively accidental ways, deepening the religious side of the story. And I think that mixing it with the military one was a pretty good idea. And certain things probably that I say are truly unique because of my specific path and what I've been doing here and outside of here. So, and I can tell you, yeah, it's good stuff. Like, if you look at history of religions, the way I deal with them, normally it's quite specific, especially the series about ancient Christianity. I think it really speaks volumes about the complete mistake, like how wrong the sort of flat narrative we've been given officially also from historiography about Christian history is. And I say what I say is good because, if anything, I, as you understand here, work from the sources, right? People have been complaining about the fact that I don't provide with a bibliography in the end, just the Wikimedia Commons credit for the images and all this stuff, but the actual thing is that if I, for example, like if I make a video on specific sources, I just list them in the moment in which I'm explaining them. So what's your point of needing a bibliography if you don't even know what I'm saying in the video, how I use that source? I've been improving. Schwerpunkt has been improving largely, and I'm quite satisfied and proud with you. You wouldn't believe, regardless of the very scarce views that we still have in general, but I see that you're interested. I see that you stick around in a way or another, and I know it's difficult to really stay here and listen to my rambles, but in many ways, you know, that they're always apropos, right? They're always ad hoc. They're not randomly thrown out there. Say, today we talk about monasticism, and then I'm telling you something that basically you could find literally on a school history book, because that's what YouTube channels have mostly become. This is really different, and it would be great to, of course, give Schwerpunkt to schools instead of their programs. We would live in a much better world. It would be fantastic. Can you imagine that? The consequences, crusades, you know, an imperial Catholic empire, Constantinople retaken, Western absolute dominance over the entire globe, and more and more. Actually, we actually have it already. It's just we could fulfill it completely more and more. But in any case, it's it is really another story. And if anything, if Schwerpunkt keeps growing, I never thought I never really searched for specifically becoming viral or something, but I presume that the more we work in here, the more we're going to achieve something. So that's why I tell you also to share, especially in other channels, etc., because people literally don't know that I'm here. I have a good engagement rate. I am not doing badly overall in that relative realm, but in absolute terms, of course, these views are very scarce, and so we must do something about it. That's pretty much it. But again, I also see that the system is so big. Like I uploaded so much content that at a point it's starting to get its own gravitational attraction, and it's relatively easy to spread this knowledge to more people. And I count on the fact that we're continuing. There are ups and downs. Sometimes they're seasonal. Sometimes they are just random. But again, it does feel like maybe, in the past years I told you things like it feels like we are already at the beginning. And yes, we are already at the beginning, there is no doubt. But I think we have taken like a step into some kind of more, in some few ways, into a bit more of a core content. And it's just a first approach. So we're just in this transitional phase. And it feels like certain things, yes, we just made a premise to, and others we began to discuss them in a relatively satisfactory way. And I can tell you that we are probably breaking the mold here. So to some extent, we are exhausting in some cycle branches. We're going to talk more about contemporary history, also non-military one. So Schwerpunkt is never going to exhaust its power. I hope, if anything, YouTube remains relatively accessible and relevant over time, because, say, by continuing like this, we can make it. Then there can be any major reason for which this thing does not go on. But as far as I'm concerned, I've been learning so much from this, from Schwerpunkt itself, from you, and all that. I feel it to be really useful for me, and that's actually the first benefit that I have from this. But again, we don't have to put limits to providence, and let's try to keep pushing on the accelerator, because that's really what matters the most here at the end of the day. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.